In a high-stakes battle, Jasmine Crockett goes head-to-head with Marjorie Taylor Greene, fiercely opposing her shocking proposal to slash Alzheimer's care funding by 60%, a decision that could rip apart the lives of millions. As the heated debate escalates, Crockett exposes the brutal truth behind the $290 billion cost of Alzheimer's care, while revealing the heartbreaking sacrifices of unpaid family caregivers who have been left to shoulder the burden alone. With every word, she demands not just to protect, but to radically expand research and support, risking everything to change the course of history. Will Crockett's unwavering emotional appeal break through, or will Greene's cold, calculated policy seal the fate of countless families? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber of the House hearing room stood silent and heavy, lined with dark oak panels and lit by steady, clinical overhead lights. In front of each lawmaker, red microphone lights glowed, live, recording, and ready. At the center hung a formal placard, House Committee on Public Health and Aging Budgets. Cameras panned slowly across the dais, capturing tense expressions and rigid postures. Behind them, rows of gallery seats were filled with elderly citizens and grieving families. Many held framed photos, fathers in uniform, mothers smiling before illness stole their minds. Their faces were still, but their eyes screamed, "Don't let them erase us." The press box whispered like a hive. Reporters leaned close, scribbling notes and murmuring updates. "Greene's about to call for a 60% cut to Alzheimer's funding," one voice said, low but sharp. That number, 60%, hung in the air like a threat. A woman in the front row clutched her late husband's portrait tighter, knuckles white. Jasmine Crockett sat near the edge of the panel, motionless, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward. Around her, the hearing felt less like a policy session and more like the quiet before a brutal verdict. And then, just as the silence threatened to crack under its own pressure, she rose. Marjorie Taylor Greene stood with a mechanical calm, like a blade drawn from its sheath. The gray of her blazer matched the steel in her gaze, cold, smooth, and calculated. No glance toward the audience, no flicker of empathy. Her hand gripped a dense stack of briefing papers, crisp edges sharp under her manicured fingers. Her heels clicked once against the marble floor as she stepped forward, steady, unapologetic. Then she spoke, flat, deliberate, without crescendo or softness, her voice more function than feeling. "I am not here to be kind," she began, each syllable slicing through the air like a verdict. "I am here to save the budget." The words fell with chilling precision, detonating not with volume, but with intent. Behind her, someone in the gallery inhaled audibly. A photograph shifted in a trembling hand. She didn't flinch. Her face remained utterly still, as though sculpted from concrete. "Alzheimer's patients no longer contribute to our economy," she said next without blinking. "They require care, not investment. Our nation cannot afford sentimentality masquerading as fiscal policy." It was the kind of statement that doesn't echo. It detonates. No stammer, no hesitation. Just the arithmetic of utility wrapped in the indifference of power. She glanced down at her notes once, not to find her place, but to signal she didn't care what reaction followed. "If we want to build a future," she said, "we must fund the living engines of productivity, not preserve what can no longer function." The room chilled further, as if her very presence had lowered the temperature. On the Democratic bench, a few lawmakers shifted uncomfortably, furrowed brows, clenched jaws, but none interrupted. Whether it was caution, strategy, or pure disbelief, they said nothing. Greene had claimed the microphone and wrapped the hearing in silence, not by raising her voice, but by lowering the value of human life to a budget line. She stood in full command of the moment, but behind her, unseen by her, something was beginning to rise. Jasmine Crockett, still silent, had not blinked once. The silence that followed wasn't stillness, it was suffocation. From the second Greene's final sentence landed, the air inside the hearing room turned into glass, clear, rigid, and on the edge of shattering. In the second row, a woman in her 70s, wrapped in a faded lavender shawl, lifted a hand to her mouth. Her eyes welled instantly, And despite her efforts, the sob broke free. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, helpless, real. Beside her, a younger man, perhaps her son, reached over and gently gripped her trembling hand, anchoring her in place as if afraid she might break entirely. The camera caught it in perfect clarity. Her tears, the whiteness of her knuckles, the blurred edge of a photograph folded in her lap. And then, like a slow-turning tide, the lens drifted across the gallery, faces stiff with rage, a jaw clenched so hard it trembled, an elderly veteran narrowing his eyes behind bifocals, eyes wide, lips pressed into silence. No one yelled. No one needed to. The room didn't erupt. It simmered. Then the camera swung, not with drama, but with intention. It locked onto Jasmine Crockett like a sniper scope. She sat motionless, shoulders squared, posture composed, but tension radiated from every inch of her body. Her right hand held a pen, its metal tip hovering just above yellow legal paper, a half-formed word frozen mid-thought. Her lips were sealed in a tight line, unmoving, unreadable. But the camera caught it, a single tremor in her fingers. Not from fear, not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of what she had just witnessed. The kind of injustice that demands silence before fire. And in that flicker of a hand, in that breath she did not take, something shifted, not just in her, but in the room. The crowd didn't see it yet. Greene didn't feel it yet. But the reckoning had already begun. The tremor in her hand had passed, but what remained was something far more controlled, far more dangerous. It was not a reaction. It was a decision. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat in a motion so slow, so precise, that it stole the attention from every corner of the room without a single word. Her chair made the faintest groan against the marble floor, a subtle crack in the oppressive silence. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't adjust her blazer. Her eyes were already fixed, trained like a laser on Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she did not blink. There was no flourish, no theatrics, only stillness, carved with intent. A force began to gather behind her presence, not loud but inevitable. She stood not just to speak, but to defend. Not herself, not her party, but something far older, far more sacred, memory and the right to be remembered. When she spoke, her voice came low, measured, every syllable planted like a stake in the ground. My mother, she began, her gaze unbroken, was a frontline nurse for 30 years. She didn't say it to boast. She said it as if it were a sworn fact that had been ignored too long. She held dying children in her arms. She worked double shifts through hurricanes and flu seasons. She stitched open wounds and caught newborns in emergency rooms where the air smelled like rust and fear. Her breath caught slightly, but she didn't falter. And today, she can't remember my father's name. The words didn't need embellishment. They didn't echo. They punched. Greene didn't move. Behind Crockett, the gallery leaned forward in absolute silence, as if 1 inch closer might protect them from the violence of forgetting. Crockett turned slowly from Greene to the room itself, to the grieving and the forgotten, and the families who had come here not for politics, but for acknowledgement. Her voice deepened, not in anger but in conviction. She doesn't remember who she saved. She doesn't remember the faces. But that doesn't mean we get to forget her. She paused, holding the silence like a blade to the throat of the moment. She deserves respect, not because of what she can give us now, but because of who she already gave us then. No one moved. No one exhaled. Crockett stood like a pillar in the storm, unshaken, unafraid. For a single breathless moment, time inside the chamber froze. And in that moment, it was no longer a hearing. It was a reckoning. As Crockett's words hung in the air, thick with gravity, Greene made her move. A quick, sharp shift that sliced through the tension like a blade. Without hesitation, she reached for her microphone, her fingers nimble but deliberate. With a sharp twist, she lowered it slightly, adjusting the angle as if to frame the conversation on her terms. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried an unspoken command. This moment belonged to her now. Her eyes never left Crockett. The room, so still a moment before, buzzed in anticipation. Then, with the smoothness of a practiced politician, Greene spoke, her voice cool and dispassionate. cutting through the room with clinical precision. "I understand the pain," she said, her tone neutral, almost patronizing in its flatness. "But if we start making national policy based on emotion, this country will go bankrupt." The words were slow, deliberate, each one a calculated stroke designed to extinguish the fire that Crockett had ignited. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften. It was as if she was dismissing not only the people in that room, but the very lives behind their struggles. She reduced their suffering to numbers, to costs. No compassion, no understanding, just cold, sterile efficiency. The words lingered in the air like smoke. A few in the room shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her statement pressing down, but none spoke out. There was no need. Greene had already set the stage, and the few allies she had in the room knew the game. A Republican lawmaker seated on the other side of the room gave a subtle nod, a silent approval. His expression remained stoic, his eyes never wavering from the proceedings. But the gesture was enough. It was a signal. This was the way forward. And Crockett? She was nothing more than an obstacle in their path. Crockett didn't respond immediately. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she rush to make a counterattack. No, she remained still, her body rooted in the gravity of the moment, her focus never leaving Greene. She turned her head just slightly, a small shift, an almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough to carry the weight of 1,000 thoughts. Her gaze cut into Greene, sharp and steady, as though she were studying the very core of the woman before her. There was no tremor in her expression, no hesitation. Her eyes, however, were another story. They were cold, cold like iron heated to the point of breaking. The look was unmistakable. It was not the expression of a politician responding to a rebuttal. It was the look of someone who had been pushed to the edge of patience and was now preparing to tear that edge apart. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the stillness of her demeanor, the intensity of her gaze. The room seemed to hold its breath. Greene, oblivious or perhaps unbothered by the weight of that stare, continued to speak. But the power had shifted. What had been a moment of arrogance from Greene now seemed almost like a trap, waiting for the inevitable response that would turn the room on its head. In that stillness, Crockett did not need to say anything. Her silence was more cutting than any words could be. It was a promise, an unspoken vow. This fight was far from over. The moment stretched, suspended between silence and inevitable confrontation. Crockett knew the stakes now. This wasn't just about words. This wasn't just about a policy battle. This was about the lives of families who had trusted the system to protect them. Greene had already made her case, cold and unyielding. But Crockett was not here to merely argue. She was here to expose the truth, to make sure that truth couldn't be buried under budget cuts or political rhetoric. Her fingers brushed the table, steadying herself as she clicked a button on her tablet. The projector hummed to life, casting a sharp beam of light against the far wall. A sleek, color-coded graph appeared, outlining a brutal truth in black and white clarity. On the left side, the numbers rose like jagged mountains. Alzheimer's care costs, 2025, $290 billion in bold, unforgiving letters. The graph's upward slope didn't taper, didn't level out. It skyrocketed, as if mocking the idea that the disease could be contained or mitigated by slashing funding. It was a terrifying visual, the cost of care mirrored by the increasing toll of lives, of human suffering. And on the right side of the graph, a single, simple line of red text appeared. Crockett's voice rang out, clear, with unshakable conviction. "Cutting the budget doesn't stop the disease," she said, the words sharp as a whip. "It doesn't erase Alzheimer's. It just ensures more families will suffer, more will die. It doesn't save money, it kills more people." The room hung in the balance as the weight of her statement settled. The camera zoomed in on her face, eyes cold, unwavering, yet laced with the raw power of undeniable truth. Crockett didn't blink. She didn't need to. The numbers on the screen were the evidence, and they spoke louder than any politician's rhetoric ever could. She paused for just a moment, letting the reality of those figures sink in. Behind her, the audience stirred, a palpable sense of discomfort running through the rows of spectators. Some glanced down at their hands. Others shifted in their seats. The uncomfortable truth was out in the open. Greene's financial logic was a sterile theory, divorced from the human cost. But Crockett had brought the faces, the families, into the equation. This was no longer about policies on paper. This was about people, families, lives. And if anyone dared to ignore that, they would have to face her. The room, still thick with the weight of Crockett's words, seemed to grow even heavier. The reality of the numbers, $290 billion, had struck a nerve. But now Crockett shifted gears. She wasn't here to show the cold facts. She was here to remind them, all of them, of the human cost behind the charts. The cost that no spreadsheet could capture, no budget cut could fix. She took a breath, steadying herself, then let the words fall from her lips. Slow, deliberate, cutting straight through the silence. 75% of caregivers are family members, she began, her voice low but resolute. They're mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. They don't get paid. They don't get time off. They work day in and day out, without a single moment to rest. For 10 years, they care for their loved ones. And when they're done, when the burden's been carried, no one remembers their names. Her words hit like a hammer, each one striking harder than the last. The camera lingered on the faces in the room, capturing the weight of what she had just said. Some lawmakers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the floor, unable to meet the truth. Others, those who had come here to make policy decisions, sat frozen, their stoic faces cracked with the tension of what they were hearing. Their pens moved faster now, scribbling notes they couldn't ignore. And there was Greene, ever the embodiment of cold logic, sitting with her arms crossed, a fortress of defiance against the emotional storm sweeping through the chamber. But even she seemed to flinch, just the slightest clench of her jaw. She couldn't hide it completely, not when Crockett had peeled back the mask of policy and revealed the beating heart beneath it. The camera panned slowly across the room, capturing the reluctance, the discomfort, the flicker of realization in those who had remained indifferent moments before. The faces of those who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen the truth that Crockett was serving to them, raw and undiluted. There was no chart, no policy, just families, lives, and memories slipping through the cracks of a system that had long since lost its compassion. Crockett didn't pause. She didn't give them a moment to forget. Her gaze cut across the room, sharp and steady, as if daring anyone to deny what she'd just exposed. 10 years for nothing, forgotten. And you think cutting funding will fix this? The words were like a slap to the face, unrelenting in their urgency. And as the silence stretched, Crockett's eyes locked on Greene's. And for just a fleeting moment, the weight of that silence pressed down on her, on all of them. The camera held a shot, a single moment that felt like an eternity. The tension that hung in the room was thick, suffocating even, as Crockett's words lingered in the air. Every eye in the chamber was fixed on Greene, waiting for her to respond, expecting her to crumble under the weight of the truth that had just been laid out. But Greene, as always, remained a picture of unyielding control. Her posture was perfect, her arms crossed, her gaze unflinching. She didn't seem moved, at least not outwardly. Instead, she took a moment, as though carefully selecting her next move, before she leaned forward slightly, the faintest glimmer of a smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a smile of empathy or even acknowledgement. It was a smile of confidence, one that said, "I've got this." It was the smile of someone who had long ago made peace with the harsh realities of governance. Someone who believed that the cuts they were about to make were not just necessary, but inevitable. With a deliberate, almost dismissive motion, Greene lowered her microphone just a fraction of an inch. Then with a slow exhale, she began to speak, her voice calm, but cutting like a blade through the fragile tension that had built. "Let me remind you," she said, her words deliberate, measured, each one falling with the weight of a decision already made. "The budget is not about emotion. If we don't make these cuts here, we'll have to slash something else. Education programs, STEM initiatives, even child nutrition. We will have to choose between a future and a memory." The words were clinical, like a doctor delivering bad news with a cold smile. She paused, letting the implications of her statement settle in the room. The camera captured her every move, her steady gaze, her unmoving posture. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like she was relishing the discomfort of the room, like she had won this argument before it even began. Crockett, however, was unshaken. Greene wasn't finished yet. "I choose the future over memory," she said, the finality in her voice a sharp contrast to the raw emotion that had filled the room moments before. The words were a simple declaration, one that reduced the value of human lives to a mere calculation, to a choice between cold, hard pragmatism and a sentimentality she considered unnecessary. The room was still. The words hung there, thick in the air, like a weighted blanket pressing down on everyone in the room. Greene had drawn a line in the sand, and now she was daring anyone to cross it. Crockett could feel it, a shift in the atmosphere, a heaviness that threatened to overwhelm her. But she wasn't about to let Greene's cold, calculated logic stand uncontested. She wasn't here to argue about numbers. She was here to remind them of the real people who would bear the brunt of their decisions. Without a word, Crockett reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the files inside. The room fell into a hush, the tension crackling like static in the air. As she slowly withdrew a thick folder from her briefcase, the sound of the paper rustling felt deafening in the silence. She placed the folder on the table in front of her with a deliberate, almost defiant motion. The soft thud echoed throughout the room, a sound that seemed to reverberate through every person present. The gesture wasn't subtle. It wasn't a simple move to shift the conversation. It was a declaration. This wasn't just paperwork. This wasn't just another set of numbers. This was proof. Proof of the lives lost, the families destroyed, and the human cost of their cold logic. And Crockett wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to let Greene erase the lives she had just put on display with a few well-placed words. The room felt suffocating as the words between Crockett and Greene settled into the air. Greene's logic hung there, cold and clinical, but it hadn't been enough to silence the truth. Crockett stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of the stakes. This wasn't just a budget debate anymore. It was a battle for humanity, a fight to ensure that the people behind the policies, the ones who lived and died by these decisions, were seen. Her gaze never wavered from Greene as she made the deliberate decision to bring something far more personal into the conversation. She turned slowly, her hand brushing against the thick stack of paper she had brought with her. She lifted it from the table, the weight of it pressing down on her arms. But it wasn't just paper. It was a tangible truth. The weight of the fight, the sacrifice of millions of families, was in this stack, in these signatures. And Crockett wasn't about to let anyone ignore it. With purpose, she made her way toward the witness table, each step echoing in the heavy silence that had descended. The soft click of her heels against the marble floor was the only sound, a metronome marking the passage of time. Every eye in the room was locked on her, waiting for her next move. As she reached the table, she placed the pile of papers down with a resounding thud. The sound was sharp, immediate, a punctuation mark in the quiet tension. It echoed, a silent declaration. This was not a game, not a political chess match. This was real. 1,000,000 signatures in 9 days, Crockett began, her voice unwavering, as though each syllable had been forged in fire. The majority of them are from those who have cared for Alzheimer's patients, those who have given their time, their energy, and their lives to these people. People who know what it's like to watch someone you love disappear in slow motion. And yet they are ignored. Their voices are drowned out by numbers that do not reflect the human cost. Her words didn't need to be louder. Their weight was enough to carry them. She let the quiet settle in between her sentences, giving the room time to digest what she had just said. This wasn't a question of policy. This was a question of who mattered. And for Crockett, the answer was clear. The families, those people who had signed that petition, those who had spent years caring for their loved ones without recognition, they mattered. She paused for just a moment, then slowly turned to face Greene. Their eyes locked. The room was still. Too still. The air seemed to constrict. Crockett's voice cut through the silence with a quiet, powerful conviction. This isn't about emotion. This is about the people. This is about the families who have given everything, and received nothing in return. And you, Ms. Greene, are standing here, pretending that their sacrifice is just a line item on a budget sheet. The words fell with precision, each one an unflinching reminder that policy could not afford to overlook the lives at the heart of it. Crockett wasn't looking for sympathy. She was demanding accountability. The camera zoomed in slowly on the pile of papers now resting on the table. The names of states began to appear, one by one, highlighted as the camera focused. California, Florida, Texas, Ohio. Each state a testament to the lives affected. Each signature a powerful declaration that they were not invisible. Crockett didn't need to explain it further. The camera did the work for her, each name that appeared on the screen louder than any word spoken in the room. The silence that followed was heavy. Greene's gaze shifted, just briefly, to the pile of papers before her eyes returned to Crockett. She couldn't ignore it. No one in the room could. The weight of those names was too much to disregard, and Crockett knew it. She didn't flinch. She stood firm, unwavering in the face of Greene's cold logic. Crockett's message was clear. The truth had been laid out before them, and there would be no turning away. The room was thick with tension, the air charged with unspoken thoughts, as Crockett's words echoed off the walls. But Greene's composure never faltered. Where others may have been rattled, she stood unbroken. The truth that Crockett had just laid bare, the faces, the names, the lives, seemed to have no effect on Greene. She simply adjusted her position in her chair, her body language giving nothing away. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick, until Greene's voice cut through it, steady and devoid of emotion. Has anyone verified the validity of these numbers? Her voice was dry, almost mechanical, as if she were questioning the weather rather than the lives of millions. It wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was a challenge, a dismissal wrapped in polite skepticism. Her gaze didn't shift. She stared ahead, focused solely on Crockett, daring her to respond with anything other than what Greene had already decided was the truth. The question hung in the air, charged with condescension. As if on cue, a dry laugh came from the independent side of the room, sharp, hollow, the kind of laugh that came not from humor, but from an attempt to dismiss the uncomfortable reality sitting in front of them. It was a sound that grated on the nerves, cutting through the heavy silence like a shard of glass. And yet, Crockett did not respond immediately. She didn't let herself be dragged into the trap of Greene's games. She stood still, her face a mask of calm resolve. There was no flinch, no anger. She knew the battle wasn't won with shouting or fiery words. It was won with truth, and it was time to show them the truth. Slowly, deliberately, Crockett reached for her briefcase. The soft rustle of leather filled the room, adding to the tension that had already settled thick in the air. Her hand moved with purpose, each motion controlled. Yet there was a slight tremor in her fingers, barely perceptible, just enough to reveal the weight of the moment. It wasn't fear or hesitation. It was the weight of justice, the unbearable responsibility of having to force the truth into a room that wanted to close its eyes. She didn't rush. There was no need to hurry. The sound of the envelope tearing open was sharp, like the crack of a whip, cutting through the heavy silence. As the envelope came apart in her hands, the room seemed to lean forward, eyes focused on the document she was about to reveal. Crockett held the document up for a moment, allowing the room to settle on it, to see that this was no longer a question of rhetoric. It was a question of proof, evidence that couldn't be ignored. Crockett didn't need to explain what was inside the envelope. The camera caught every detail, the slight tremble of her hand as she held it out, the focus in her eyes as they stayed locked on Greene. She didn't need to say a word more. The document, the proof, was all that mattered. It was time for Greene and everyone else in that room to face the truth that couldn't be wiped away by dismissive questions or thinly veiled arrogance. The air in the room thickened once again, and Crockett knew the moment had come. Greene had tried to deflect, to redirect the conversation into numbers and dry policies, but Crockett wasn't going to let that happen. This wasn't about saving money. This was about people, about lives that had already been lost, about the suffering that had already been carried. The cold efficiency of Greene's arguments had ignored the heart of the matter. Now it was time to make sure no one in the room could ignore it any longer. Crockett reached into the pile of documents, her movements deliberate, careful. Her fingers brushed the edges of the folded letter, worn and slightly creased from time. It felt like it had been carried with someone for years, perhaps decades, and as she pulled it out, she knew that what was inside had the power to do what statistics never could. She took a slow, measured breath, the weight of her next words pressing on her chest. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the stillness of her face, the deliberate way she unfolded the letter, and the faint tremor in her hand. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but there, a testament to how much this mattered. The letter was short. There were no grand statements, no outpouring of emotion. It was simple, raw. The words themselves spoke volumes more than any carefully crafted argument could. Crockett began to read, each word carrying the weight of its own quiet power. "I am Eugene Davey," she began, her voice low but unwavering. "If one day I no longer remember who is who, please do not let anyone forget that I was a good father, a strong husband, and a United States Marine." The words seemed to hang in the air long after she finished reading them. The simplicity of the message was staggering. Do not let anyone forget. A plea not just for remembrance, but for dignity in the face of a future that would try to strip away every shred of identity. A man whose life had been defined by his service to his family, to his country, now asking not for mercy, but for the basic recognition of his humanity, his worth. And Crockett made sure that every person in that room felt it. A slight shift in the gallery, a woman wiping her eyes, a man squeezing his wife's hand a little tighter. It was subtle, but it didn't escape the camera. The words that had come from Eugene Davis weren't just about Alzheimer's. They were about being human, about not allowing the most vulnerable in society to be swept aside, forgotten, when they could no longer speak for themselves. They were about not letting the loss of memory be equated with the loss of value. Crockett folded the letter with deliberate care, a silent gesture of reverence for the words that had just been shared. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. She didn't need to say another word. The letter had done its work. Her eyes lifted slowly, once again locking with Greene's. The room held its breath, and Crockett's gaze didn't waver. There was no need for further explanation, no need to plead for understanding. The truth had been laid out in front of them, bare and unassailable. The question was no longer about budget cuts or policies. It was about something far more fundamental, the humanity of those who would be affected by these decisions. And Crockett had made sure that everyone in that room knew it. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. The truth had been spoken, and now it was up to them to decide how to respond. The room had become suffocating in its stillness, and as Crockett stood there, the weight of her last statement settled like a stone in the pit of every stomach present. Greene's face remained an immovable mask, but Crockett could feel the crack in the veneer. For just a second, there had been the briefest flicker in her eyes, a tiny crack in the fortress of indifference that Greene had built. But Crockett wasn't going to let it pass. She wasn't going to let the room forget what was at stake. Her back straightened, spine locking into place, as if drawing every ounce of resolve from the core of her being. Her eyes, usually calm, now burned with an intensity that could set fire to the room itself. This wasn't about numbers anymore. It wasn't about debating policies. This was about lives, about the families who had been ignored, about the elderly who were treated as nothing more than statistics, and about the injustice that Greene had just wrapped in a cold veneer of logic. Crockett wasn't going to let that stand. She took one step forward, the movement slow but deliberate, her gaze never leaving Greene's face. Each step was like the quiet approach of a storm, building in strength, ready to break. Her voice, when it came, was steady and commanding, but the words carried the weight of 1,000 forgotten souls. If our parents, our loved ones, lose their memories, if they lose the very thing that makes them who they are they to be discarded? Crockett's voice didn't tremble, but there was something raw beneath the surface, something that trembled within her but refused to break free. Do they deserve to be forgotten? To be left behind as if they were nothing more than a burden? Her words landed with an almost physical impact, each syllable piercing through the room like an arrow aimed straight at the heart of Greene's cold logic. The chamber was frozen in place, the tension building in every moment of silence between her words. The camera panned across the room, capturing the faces of the other lawmakers. Some looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others staring ahead with brows furrowed, unable to ignore the force of Crockett's words. The camera then shifted, landing squarely on Greene's face. Her lips tightened, her eyes narrowing, but no words came. There was no deflection this time, no quick retort. She was caught, and the silence stretched on. For a brief moment, Greene's eyes seemed to waver, her grip on her composure slipping ever so slightly. It was a small thing, a tightening of her jaw, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, but it was enough to show that Crockett's question had struck at the heart of her carefully crafted argument. Greene was speechless, and for a moment the room seemed to breathe with the collective weight of what had just been said. Crockett didn't break eye contact. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering, like a lighthouse in a storm. She didn't need to say another word. Greene had been caught in the truth of every family who had given everything to care for their loved ones, the truth of every person who had been abandoned in the face of policy-driven indifference. As the seconds stretched on, the silence grew even more oppressive. It was no longer a debate. It was a moment of reckoning, a reckoning that Greene, for all her power, could not escape. Crockett had laid down the gauntlet. It wasn't about numbers or budgets anymore. It was about the lives that had been ignored, and Crockett's words, sharp and unyielding, had made sure that no one in the room could forget that truth. The silence in the room felt like it was stretching, like it was refusing to give way. Crockett stood there, unwavering, her words still hanging in the air, like a palpable force, waiting for someone to speak, to break the tension that had descended. But no one spoke immediately. The gravity of the moment was too heavy, too real. Greene remained silent, her face still hard, a slight twitch in her jaw, betraying the discomfort she felt, though she refused to acknowledge it. Crockett had done it. She had exposed the hollowness of the arguments she was up against. But Greene wasn't finished yet. She had more to say, more to do. But in this moment, Crockett's truth was the only thing that mattered. And she held that truth in the room, unwavering, as though daring anyone to challenge it. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, a lone figure at the back of the room began to stir. A single hand rose from the far end of the gallery, hesitantly at first, and then, like the ripple of a stone dropped into still water, more hands began to follow. A soft murmur spread throughout the gallery, growing in volume and intensity. A quiet, rising wave of agreement that seemed to reach every corner of the room. It wasn't loud at first, no cheering, no shouting, just a steady, almost reverential clap from one man in the back, followed by another and then another. The sound was quiet at first, but as it swelled, it became a wave, unmistakable, undeniable. People were standing. Their hands were raised, and for the first time that day, the room seemed to move in unison. And then it happened. A figure at the far back of the gallery, an elderly man dressed in the faded uniform of a veteran, rose from his seat with slow deliberation. His face was lined with the marks of years, of battles fought, of memories, perhaps even more fleeting than the ones Crockett had spoken of. But his eyes were sharp, focused. He stood tall, the weight of age and experience pulling him down. But his movements were still precise, still purposeful. He raised his hand slowly, lifting it to his brow in a slow, deliberate salute. His gesture was not a small one. It wasn't an ordinary show of respect. It was a military salute, reserved for the most solemn of moments when the honor of service demanded recognition. The room seemed to pause again. His salute wasn't just to Crockett, it was to the entire truth she had just forced into the light. It was an acknowledgement that went beyond the words spoken in that room. It was the recognition of a deeper sacrifice, one that hadn't been given the respect it deserved. It was the recognition that what Crockett had said was true, that the lives being affected weren't just numbers or statistics, but people who had given everything, who had served and loved and fought without asking for anything in return. As the old man stood there, his salute held in place, the gallery felt completely still. The soft murmur of clapping had quieted. The camera panned over the faces in the room, showing the subtle shift in their expressions. The faces that had once been cold, detached, now filled with the quiet recognition of the human cost that Crockett had so skillfully exposed. Some lawmakers, who had been nodding in agreement with Greene only moments ago, were now looking at each other, unsure, their faces betraying their discomfort. Others were focused, locked in that moment of solemnity, as though they too recognized that this wasn't a battle of policy anymore. This was a battle for the soul of the country, its values, its integrity, its humanity. The applause in the gallery wasn't loud, but it was steady, and it grew with every passing second. It wasn't about just agreeing with Crockett. It wasn't about being on her side. It was about recognizing the simple truth of what she had said, what every family, every caregiver, every person in that room understood. It was a truth that had been ignored for too long, that had been buried beneath budget cuts, fiscal policies, and the cold logic of numbers. But Crockett had forced it to the surface, and now there was no hiding from it. The old man's salute, his quiet tribute, had become the living embodiment of the recognition they had all been too afraid to give. Crockett stood tall, unwavering, as the camera caught the slow, measured applause that spread like wildfire through the room. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge the clapping. She didn't need to. This wasn't about her. This was about the people who had been forgotten. This was about the families who had lived in silence for too long, who had carried the weight of Alzheimer's and other diseases without recognition, without support. And now, for the first time, someone was giving them a voice. Crockett's eyes remained fixed on the man in the back of the room, on his salute. The gesture wasn't just symbolic, it was a call to action, a reminder that the fight wasn't over, that every person in that room, every person in the country, had a responsibility to make sure that the voices of the vulnerable were heard. As the applause began to die down, the silence returned, thicker this time, heavier. But it was different now. It wasn't just an uncomfortable quiet. It was the quiet of recognition, of understanding. It was the kind of silence that comes when the truth has been spoken, when there is nothing more to say because the truth has already been revealed. Crockett didn't look away. Her gaze remained steady, unflinching, as if daring anyone in the room to question what had just happened. The room, once divided, now seemed united in this single powerful truth. The sound of the veterans' salute still echoed in their minds, a solemn reminder of the sacrifice and dignity that had been demanded, and the responsibility that now rested on their shoulders. In that moment, Crockett had made sure that they would never forget, and she had shown them what true courage looked like, not in the bravado of words, but in the quiet strength of standing for what was right, even when the world seemed to be on the wrong side. As the room fell into the silence of Crockett's unspoken challenge, something shifted. The words that had been spoken, those words that carried the weight of every family affected by Alzheimer's, didn't just stay in that room. They didn't remain contained within the polished walls of the Capitol building. No, they broke free and rippled outward, spreading through the veins of the nation like wildfire. The moment that the video of Crockett reading Eugene Davis's letter was posted online, it took on a life of its own. A simple hashtag born from the raw power of the words spoken began to trend. My father still matters. It was just a hashtag, yet it captured everything that had been exposed in that chamber. The families, the caregivers, the forgotten. It was a declaration that could not be ignored. It became a symbol, a movement, a call to arms for anyone who had been left behind, anyone who had been pushed aside in the name of fiscal responsibility, anyone who had given everything for someone they loved, only to watch as their sacrifice went unnoticed. Within hours, the clip of Crockett reading the letter, Eugene Davis's heartfelt plea, went viral. It was shared across platforms, from Facebook to Twitter, from Instagram to TikTok, and in just 2 hours, the video racked up an astounding 5 million views. The numbers were staggering, but they didn't matter. The real story wasn't the statistics. It was the faces of the people who had watched it. The elderly man in Ohio who had cared for his wife for 15 years. The mother in Florida who had given up her job to care for her daughter. the daughter in California who had watched her father's memory fade until she barely recognized him anymore. They were all watching, and they were all listening. They saw themselves in Eugene's letter. They felt his pain. They knew his loss, and they were not going to stay silent any longer. As the clip spread, so did the momentum. Thousands of shares, thousands of comments. The hashtags exploded. My father still matters. Remember them. Stop the cuts. The voices that had been silenced for so long were now demanding to be heard. The silence that had once been imposed by lawmakers, by political apathy, was now being shattered by a collective cry of outrage. It wasn't just the people in that room who were listening. It was the entire country. And they were no longer willing to accept the lies, the dismissals, or the ignorance that had been served up in the name of budget cuts. The camera zoomed in on the hashtag. The sheer simplicity of it was staggering. Just 5 words, my father still matters. But they were powerful enough to tear through the narrative of budgetary priorities, cutting right to the heart of the matter. The words still mattered because they were more than just words. They were the embodiment of the pain, the love, the sacrifice, the honor, and the memories that had been ignored for so long. No longer could they be dismissed. No longer could they be swept under the rug as if they were insignificant. These were lives, these were families, and they were demanding to be seen. Social media became a battleground, not just for policy debates, but for the very soul of the nation. The video, with its raw emotion, spread to every corner of the internet. It wasn't just people with direct experience of Alzheimer's who shared it. It was everyone who understood what it meant to love someone, to fight for them, to watch as they slipped away. The video wasn't just a message. It was a moment of collective consciousness, an awakening. In Washington, the echoes of the viral video reverberated through the halls. Lawmakers who had once been steadfast in their positions, who had clung to their budgets and their arguments, now found themselves forced to answer questions from their constituents. They couldn't ignore the voices that had suddenly become so loud. They couldn't pretend that the families who had been quietly suffering were just numbers on a page. The pressure was mounting, and Crockett knew that the battle was just beginning. But for now, in the quiet moments after the video had exploded across the nation, Crockett stood firm. Her words had left an indelible mark, not just on the room she had stood in, but on the entire country. And with every new view, every share, and every hashtag, it became clearer that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the room's atmosphere crackled with anticipation, Crockett stood still, her eyes locked on Greene. The silence had become a heavy weight, suffocating the chamber. Greene's face, though unchanged, seemed to reflect a slight shift in the air. There was no more pretending that her logic had gone unchallenged. She had been caught, but as was her nature, she wouldn't back down quietly. After a long pause, Greene finally broke the silence, her voice colder than ever, cutting through the tension like a blade. I will withdraw the proposal, pending further review, she said, her words calculated, mechanical. There was no apology in her voice, no acknowledgement of the humanity Crockett had put before her. It was merely a move, a stalling tactic, a way to regain control of the situation. She made her concession, but it was as hollow as her previous arguments had been. There was no remorse, no reckoning with the injustice Crockett had exposed. Greene's eyes remained cold and calculating, the slight rise of her chin signaling that she still believed she held the upper hand. But Crockett wasn't finished. She wasn't about to let Greene get away with this shallow retreat. She had given the room the truth, and now she would give them the solution, a solution that would ensure no one could ignore the costs any longer. Crockett took a deliberate step forward, her movements smooth yet powerful. The room watched in quiet expectation. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to. Her silence was just as commanding, just as urgent as her words. The tension in the room was taut, everyone knowing that what she was about to propose would demand more than just polite consideration. It would demand action. I propose the creation of a national memory fund, Crockett said, her voice strong and unyielding. Her words didn't just fill the space, they carried. Not just to preserve the budget, but to double the funding for research into Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. To make sure that no family, no caregiver, no person affected by these diseases is ever forced to carry the burden alone again. The words hit the room like a shockwave. It wasn't a policy suggestion. It was a direct challenge to the system that had allowed these injustices to persist. Crockett wasn't just offering a solution. She was demanding that the government take responsibility for the suffering it had ignored for so long. She didn't just want to preserve the status quo. She wanted to change it. She wanted to ensure that future generations would not face the same battles, the same abandonment that had haunted the families and caregivers who had been forgotten. The silence in the room deepened, everyone aware that this was no longer a discussion about budgets. It was a moral stand. Greene, for the first time in the entire hearing, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. There was no sharp rebuttal, no attempt to diminish Crockett's proposal. She simply stared ahead, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw clenched in frustration. She knew Crockett had just set the stage for a different kind of fight, a fight that wasn't about policy or numbers. It was about human dignity, and Crockett had just raised the stakes higher than Greene could have anticipated. Crockett's eyes never left Greene as she concluded with words that carried the weight of everything she had just said, everything she had fought for. Memories may fade, but humanity must never be allowed to forget. Her voice rang out, resonant and powerful, with the finality of a statement that left no room for misinterpretation. The camera lingered on her face, capturing the unwavering resolve in her eyes, the fire that burned there, one that had been kindled not by personal ambition, but by the thousands of people who had been left to suffer in silence. This wasn't just about Alzheimer's. This wasn't about politics. This was about ensuring that the most vulnerable were never forgotten again. For a moment, the room was still. The weight of her words was too much for any quick rebuttal. No one could deny what she had just said. Crockett had made her point, and now, with a simple yet powerful statement, she had forced the room to reckon with the truth. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was a silence filled with the gravity of change, silent yet pregnant with the realization that the conversation was no longer about money or policy. It was about the very essence of humanity and whether or not they were willing to act in the name of compassion. Greene's eyes flicked briefly to the side, but her silence spoke volumes. She had no response, not because she lacked words, but because Crockett had taken the conversation to a place where no words could undo what had been said. The room was now locked in the gravity of her challenge, and Crockett's final words lingered in the air, demanding a reckoning from everyone who had been too comfortable to care. The room remained heavy, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Crockett had forced the truth to the forefront, but Greene remained impervious, her stance as solid as ever. Yet Crockett's challenge had left its mark, an undeniable crack in the foundation of their debate. There was no going back from this moment. The silence that followed was not a quiet retreat from the battlefield, but a moment of reckoning. But now, as Crockett stood there, unwavering, a new understanding began to seep through the tension. She hadn't just exposed the financial and emotional stakes. She had drawn a line in the sand, making it clear that the real fight was not about policies or budgets. It was about something far more profound: the dignity of the human spirit, the inherent worth of every person, regardless of their ability to remember, to work, or to contribute in the way society deems valuable. And in that realization, Crockett understood the deeper battle that lay ahead. Her gaze never wavered as she looked around the room. Behind her, the video footage of Eugene Davis's letter still lingered, a reminder that those lives being affected by Alzheimer's, by this system, were not faceless, nameless statistics. They were human beings, each deserving of compassion, respect, and dignity. These weren't just abstract concepts. These were people who had sacrificed their time, their energy, their lives to care for others. Families who had been left to struggle without support. Caregivers who had been cast aside in the name of political expediency. And Crockett had made it clear, the system had failed them, but she wouldn't let them be forgotten. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the intensity of her expression. Her eyes, once calm, now burned with a quiet fire. The fight was no longer just about winning the debate. It was about making sure that no one in that room could leave without confronting the truth. Crockett had already raised the stakes. She had already forced them to reckon with the human cost of their decisions. And in doing so, she had set the stage for a broader, deeper question. What kind of society were they willing to be? The lesson was stark and unavoidable. The real moral battle was not about numbers or figures. It was about the value of a life. It was about how society chooses to treat the vulnerable, the forgotten, the sick. It was about what it meant to show compassion in the face of overwhelming adversity. And as Crockett's words hung in the air, it became clear that the issue at hand wasn't about saving dollars or saving budgets. It was about saving humanity itself. She didn't raise her voice, but her presence in that room spoke louder than any political rhetoric ever could. Her steady gaze was a challenge, not just to Greene, but to everyone present. And it wasn't a challenge of power, it was a challenge of morality. How could they claim to value life if they were so willing to disregard the lives of those who were suffering in silence? How could they justify cuts to a system that was already broken, already failing those who needed it most? The silence that followed wasn't just a lull in conversation. It was the sound of that challenge sinking in. Crockett's words, her proposal, had already been planted. The question now was whether anyone in that room had the courage to answer it. Her voice was calm, but with the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions, she spoke again, slow and deliberate. If we don't act, if we don't change the way we view those in need, we've failed as a society. We've failed those who fought, who loved, and who sacrificed everything for the betterment of others. We can't allow their legacy to be forgotten. We can't allow them to become invisible, to be erased in the name of cold, detached policy. And in that moment, Crockett realized that the fight wasn't just about one budget or one piece of legislation. It was about shifting the entire narrative. It was about challenging a system that had prioritized efficiency over empathy, that had viewed people as numbers on a spreadsheet instead of recognizing them as individuals, each deserving of respect and care. And as she stood there facing a room full of lawmakers, some of whom might not have understood the gravity of what she was asking, she knew that this battle had only just begun. The camera zoomed out slowly, capturing the faces of the room, some looking down, others focused, some still caught in the riptide of what had been said. In that silence, Crockett stood firm, unshaken by the power of the forces against her. Her mission was clear. She wasn't just fighting for policy reform. She was fighting for the heart and soul of the nation, for the ideals it was built upon: compassion, justice, and the unshakable belief that no one should be left behind, no matter how much their memory fades. This wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about ensuring that no one, not a single person, would ever again be forgotten. And Crockett was prepared to fight for that truth, no matter what it took. In the end, the lesson was clear. True humanity lies not in how we treat the strong, the rich, or the powerful, but in how we care for the weakest, the most vulnerable, and those who have nothing left to give. This was Crockett's fight. This was her call to action, and she wasn't backing down. The room was electric with tension, the weight of Crockett's words still pressing down on every shoulder in the chamber. She had set the stage, challenged Greene's cold dismissal, forced the room to reckon with the humanity behind the policy. But now it was time for action. No longer would the suffering of Alzheimer's patients be swept aside in the name of budget cuts. No longer would the families and caregivers be ignored, treated as invisible statistics. Crockett wasn't just here to make a statement. She was here to drive a change, to ignite a movement that could not and would not be undone. Her gaze never wavered as she looked at those in the room. Lawmakers, colleagues, adversaries, people who held the power to change the course of the nation, and yet some of them had become numb, content with the status quo. Crockett had come to shake them from that stupor. "We are at a crossroads," she began, her voice steady but laced with the fierce urgency of someone who knew the stakes. "We can choose to be the generation that looks away, that turns a blind eye to the suffering of our most vulnerable. Or we can choose to be the generation that acts, that shows compassion and courage in the face of adversity. The choice is ours, but we must act now." The room was still, the faces of the lawmakers unreadable. But Crockett knew that the time for words was over. The time for action was here. She stepped forward, her voice rising with intensity, not to shout, but to speak with the force of truth itself. I propose we create a national memory fund, she said. The words a declaration that sent a ripple through the room. Not just to preserve the budget, but to double the funding for Alzheimer's research and care. To ensure that every person who has ever cared for a loved one with Alzheimer's has the support they deserve. To guarantee that no one has to face this battle alone, that the dignity of every human being is upheld. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in, her eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone to disagree. This is not just about numbers, she continued, her voice calm but fierce. This is about our humanity. This is about how we, as a society, choose to treat our elders, our veterans, our parents, our children. We cannot afford to let their stories end in silence. We must give them the resources to fight. We must act, and we must do it today. The air was thick with the weight of her challenge. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the unyielding determination in her eyes. Crockett knew this wasn't just about changing a policy. It was about changing the very heart of the nation. The voices of the forgotten could no longer be ignored. She had given them a voice. Now it was time for everyone in that room to answer. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.